I remember exactly where I was. Sitting in my beat-up car, outside a grocery store in Boise, Idaho, at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. My phone buzzed. It was an email I'd been dreading and obsessively refreshing for 2 weeks straight. I clicked the attachment, scanned the first line, and the entire world just tilted. 0% probability of paternity. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut, then pulled the rug out from under my feet, then set my whole life on fire. Not with anger, not immediately. Just this profound, sickening realization that 9 years of my life, every single decision, every sacrifice, had been built on a lie. A complete, utter fabrication. I kept staring at those words, rereading them, as if they might change, or reveal some hidden footnote that would make sense of it all. Like maybe I'd misunderstood. I sat there for over an hour, watching people walk in and out, their carts full of Saturday night groceries, completely oblivious. And I couldn't move. Moving meant accepting it. The strangest thing is, I didn't feel angry. Not at first. I didn't want to scream or punch something. I just felt stupid. Like the biggest fool who had ever walked the earth. As if everyone else had known this secret, and they'd all been quietly laughing behind my back for almost a decade. Every birthday party I'd shown up to, gifts in hand. Every school pickup where I'd rearranged my work schedule. Every single night I'd gone to bed exhausted because I'd spent my weekend being a dad. None of it, not in the way I thought, had been real. I couldn't tell anyone for 3 days. How do you even say something like that out loud? I went to work, sat through meetings, answered emails, pretending everything was fine. Meanwhile, my brain was on a loop, replaying every memory I had of Leo as a baby, looking for signs I'd missed. I started seeing things that weren't there, or maybe they'd always been there, and I'd just ignored them. Like how Leo had Sarah's eyes, her laugh, but nothing that looked like me. Or how, during the pregnancy, Sarah had been so strange about doctor's appointments, always going alone, always brushing off my questions. Finally, on Wednesday night, I called my brother. I just told him everything. He went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. He asked what I was planning to do. And I realized I had no idea. See, for 9 years, I had been Michael. The guy who wired child support every single month, like clockwork. The guy who showed up to birthday parties even when he wasn't welcome. Picked Leo up from school when Sarah had other priorities. Never once complained about the system that left me living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Phoenix, while she lived comfortably in a house I helped fund. I wasn't Father of the Year, I'll admit that. But I was there. I was consistent. And I never, ever made Leo feel like a burden. Sarah, my ex-wife, she made sure everyone knew I was the bad guy in our divorce. The guy who gave up on our marriage. The guy who abandoned his family. But what she conveniently forgot to mention were the 3 affairs I discovered during our marriage. Or the financial chaos she created behind my back. Or the way she'd disappear for weekends and return smelling like someone else's cologne. I didn't fight her in court back then because I wanted Leo to have stability. I didn't argue when she got primary custody because I believed a kid needed his mom. And I didn't push back when the judge set child support at a number that left me eating ramen 4 nights a week. I just paid. Kept my head down. Tried to be the dad Leo deserved, even though his mother made it clear I'd never be enough. Then, about 7 months before that Saturday night in the parking lot, her lawyer sent me a letter. Demanding an increase in child support. Not a small adjustment, but a 30% jump. The reasoning? Inflation, rising costs, and the fact that my salary had grown. I'm a financial manager. I work long hours. I've been promoted twice in the last 5 years. And yeah, I make more money now than I did when Leo was a baby. But that doesn't mean I'm swimming in cash. I still drive a car with 160,000 miles on it. I still budget every single dollar because half my paycheck disappears on the 1st of every month. Sarah, on the other hand, hasn't held a steady job in 3 years, though she picks up part-time gigs when she needs quick cash. She's constantly posting on social media about spa days and weekend getaways. Every time I picked up Leo, he'd be wearing the same worn-out shoes while she was carrying a brand-new handbag. The money I sent just didn't seem to be going where it was supposed to. And when her lawyer started throwing around phrases like financial responsibility and the child's needs, something inside me just snapped. I didn't hire a lawyer right away. I just asked for an audit. A simple breakdown of where the money was going. Receipts for Leo's expenses. Proof that the increase was actually necessary. And you'd think I'd asked her to commit a crime. Sarah blew up my phone with texts, calling me controlling, accusing me of trying to punish her, saying I was weaponizing money to hurt our son. And when I didn't back down, she started posting vague messages on social media about deadbeat dads and men who abuse the court system. My phone lit up with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, mutual friends who suddenly had strong opinions about my parenting, coworkers who saw her posts and asked if everything was okay at home. I realized she was carefully building a narrative where I was the villain, and she was the tragic victim. I wanted to scream. I wanted to post my own side of the story, but I didn't. I knew it would only make things worse. So, I stayed quiet and let her control the conversation while I figured out my next move. We had a meeting then, just the two of us, in a coffee shop in downtown Portland. I brought a folder with 9 years of payment records. Every bank statement, every receipt, every piece of proof that I'd never been late, never been negligent, never been anything but reliable. I slid the folder across the table. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt her, I just wanted transparency. She looked at me like I'd spit in her face. She didn't open the folder. Didn't even glance at it. She just stared with this cold expression and said, "You've always been like this. Always needing to be right, always needing to control everything." I felt my hands shake under the table. I wasn't angry yet. I was just exhausted. Tired of being painted as the bad guy. Tired of paying for a life I wasn't part of. Tired of pretending that everything she did during our marriage didn't matter anymore. And that's when I said it. The thing I'd been holding back for almost a decade. The question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the day I found out about her first affair. After everything you did during our marriage, after all the lies, I think I deserve to know the truth. The words came out quieter than I expected, but they landed like a bomb. I need a DNA test. For a second, Sarah just stared at me, like I'd spoken a different language. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh, but this sharp, bitter sound. She asked if I was seriously going to punish our son because I couldn't let go of the past. I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. I just wanted to know. She stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. She called me a monster, loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. Then she walked out, leaving me sitting there with my folder of useless receipts and a question I couldn't take back. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. When she finally responded, it was through her lawyer, a formal letter agreeing to the DNA test, but only if I continued paying child support during the process and covered all associated costs. I agreed. Because I didn't have a choice. And because a part of me, the part that had been there for every scraped knee and every bedtime story, still believed the test would come back positive and this whole nightmare would just be over. I scheduled the test at a clinic in downtown Portland. Sarah brought Leo in without saying a word to me. I watched my son swab the inside of his cheek while his mother stood in the corner, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was destroying his life. Leo didn't understand what was happening. He just knew his dad was being weird. And when the nurse handed me my own swab, I truly felt like the worst person in the world. That's what led to me, 2 weeks later, reading those devastating words in my car in Boise, Idaho. 0% probability of paternity. I thought a DNA test would shut down the conversation, maybe force Sarah to admit she'd been lying about the affairs. Prove I wasn't just paranoid or controlling. I had no idea it would just blow my entire life apart. Sarah didn't reach out after the test. Not a single text, not a call, nothing. And that told me everything I needed to know. She'd known. Maybe not for certain, but she'd known it was possible. And she'd spent 9 years betting I'd never ask. That I'd just keep paying, keep playing dad, and never question the story she'd sold me. On Friday, I got an email from her lawyer. Not about the test results. Still about the child support increase. As if nothing had changed. As if the DNA test was just a minor inconvenience we could move past. The email talked about setting aside our differences for Leo's sake, hoping I'd do the right thing and continue supporting my son. I almost threw my laptop across the room. I forwarded that email to Emily, a family lawyer I'd found online. She had excellent reviews and a reputation for not backing down. I scheduled a consultation for Monday morning. Emily looked at the DNA results for maybe 10 seconds before she looked up at me. She laid out my options. I could petition to terminate child support immediately. I could sue for repayment of everything I'd already paid. I could fight for custody if I wanted to maintain a relationship with Leo despite the biology. Or I could walk away completely. I told her I didn't want to hurt Leo. He didn't ask for any of this. She nodded, like she'd heard it 1,000 times before. She explained that I needed to think about myself, too. Because Sarah wasn't going to stop demanding money just because the truth was out. I signed the paperwork that day, a petition to terminate child support and a request for an emergency hearing. Emily said she'd file everything by the end of business. That's when Sarah started her campaign. And I mean campaign, because what she did next was calculated and vicious. Designed to destroy me before I could destroy her. She posted on every social media platform she had. Long, emotional posts about how I was abandoning a child I'd raised for 9 years. How I was using DNA as an excuse to escape my responsibilities. How I was traumatizing Leo by rejecting him over something he couldn't control. She didn't mention the affairs. She didn't mention the lies. She just painted herself as a struggling single mom and me as a monster who decided biology mattered more than love. My phone exploded with messages. People I barely knew telling me I was disgusting. Coworkers asking if the rumors were true. Even my own mother called to ask what I was thinking. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to post the DNA results, the affair timeline, every piece of evidence that showed who Sarah really was. But Emily told me not to. Anything I said publicly could be used against me in court. So, I just watched my reputation burn while Sarah played the victim. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. And in that time, Sarah did something I didn't expect. She named the biological father. A guy named Daniel, who'd worked with her at an insurance company back when Leo was conceived. She did it through her lawyer, in a formal statement that basically threw him under the bus while still trying to keep my wallet open. I'd never heard of Daniel. Didn't know what he looked like, or if he even knew Leo existed. But apparently, Sarah had kept in touch with him over the years, and now she was dragging him into this mess, too. Emily called me and told me things just got more complicated. Now there were 3 parties involved, me, trying to get out, Sarah, trying to keep the money flowing, and Daniel, who might not even know he had a kid. I looked Daniel up on social media. Found his profile in about 5 minutes. I spent an hour scrolling through photos of his life. He was married, had 2 kids of his own, worked as a sales manager. Looked happy in that basic suburban dad way. I wondered if he had any idea what was coming. Part of me wanted to message him, warn him, tell him Sarah was about to blow up his life the same way she'd blown up mine. But I didn't. Emily had made it clear I shouldn't contact anyone involved in the case. 2 days later, Daniel's lawyer filed a motion demanding his own DNA test. Which meant he either didn't know or didn't believe Sarah. And suddenly, there were 2 legal battles happening at once. Me trying to get out, and Daniel trying to figure out if he was in. The worst part wasn't the court dates, or the lawyers, or even the money I was spending to untangle this nightmare. The worst part was Leo. Sarah had told him some version of the story. I don't know what exactly. But when I showed up for my next scheduled visitation, he looked at me differently. Like I was a stranger. Like I'd done something wrong. He barely talked during the whole visit. Just sat on my couch playing games on his tablet. And when I tried to explain that I still cared about him, that none of this was his fault, he just shrugged and said his mom told him I didn't want to be his dad anymore. I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know how to tell a 9-year-old that his mom had lied about everything. So, I just told him that wasn't true and left it at that. But I could see he didn't believe me. Emily filed the lawsuit the following week. Not just against Sarah, but a formal petition for fraud and repayment of child support. She warned me it was going to get ugly. She said Sarah would fight back, would use every trick in the book, would try to make me look like the villain. And she was right. 2 days after the filing, Sarah's lawyer submitted evidence that I'd allegedly known about her affair with Daniel during the marriage and had accepted Leo as mine anyway. The evidence was a series of text messages between me and Sarah from years ago. Messages where I'd said things about wanting us to work and believing Leo needed both of us. They were twisting my words to make it sound like I'd known all along and had waived my right to contest paternity. I read through those old messages and felt sick. Because they were real. I had said those things. But not because I knew Leo wasn't mine. I'd said them because I was desperately trying to save a marriage that was already dead. The hearing was scheduled for early November. 2 separate cases now running parallel, mine against Sarah, and the state's case to establish Daniel as the legal father. Emily said, depending on how things went, this could drag on for months, or even years. I asked her what my chances were. She gave me the slip that told me she'd seen cases like mine go both ways. Explained that it really depended on the judge. Some saw this as clear fraud, while others saw it as a man trying to escape responsibility. We needed to be prepared for anything. I went home that night and sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, thinking about how I'd spent 9 years building a life that wasn't real. And how the only way forward was to tear it all down. Sarah called me directly for the first time in weeks, using a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, she asked if I was really going to destroy everything. I told her she'd already done that. And she hung up. The first hearing happened on a cold morning in early November. One of those days where the sky is gray and everything feels heavy. I sat in that courtroom in Seattle, Washington, watching Sarah's lawyer paint me as a man who'd raised a child for 9 years and was now abandoning him over a piece of paper. They had photos of me and Leo at birthday parties. Screenshots of text messages where I'd called him my son. Even a Father's Day card he'd made me in 2nd grade. They displayed it all like evidence of some contract I'd signed in blood. Sarah sat at her table, looking devastated, dabbing her eyes with tissues, playing the part of the heartbroken mother protecting her child from a monster. I wanted to stand up and scream that she'd lied about everything. But Emily squeezed my arm and whispered that I needed to stay calm. The judge, an older woman named Judge Albright, who looked like she'd seen every trick in the book, listened to both sides without much expression. When Sarah's lawyer finished his performance about the importance of emotional bonds over biology, Judge Albright asked one simple question that cut through all the noise. She asked if Sarah had known or suspected during the marriage that the child might not be mine. Sarah's lawyer stumbled over his words, trying to avoid a direct answer, talking about the complexities of relationships and the fog of memory. I watched Judge Albright's expression shift from neutral to skeptical in about 5 seconds. Emily stood up. She presented the DNA results, the timeline of Sarah's affair with Daniel, and the crucial fact that Sarah had never once suggested a paternity test herself, despite knowing about the affair, despite having every opportunity to come clean during the divorce proceedings 9 years ago. She brought up the child support modification request that had triggered this whole mess, pointed out that Sarah had demanded more money while simultaneously hiding information that would have made me not legally responsible for any payments at all. Emily argued that this was textbook fraud. Sarah's lawyer tried to redirect, claimed that I'd implicitly accepted paternity by being involved in Leo's life. But Emily was ready with case law showing that fraud undermines everything, that you can't enforce a contract or obligation that was based on a lie. Judge Albright called for a recess and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks. As I walked out of that courtroom, Sarah tried to approach me in the hallway, but her lawyer pulled her back. I just kept walking. I didn't hear anything for 10 days. During that time, I lived in this weird limbo, not knowing if I was still Leo's father in the eyes of the law, or if I was about to be released from a 9-year sentence I'd never deserved. I kept going to work, kept paying my bills, kept checking my email obsessively. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, Emily called and told me to sit down. Judge Albright had ruled in my favor. She terminated my child support obligation, effective in 30 days pending any appeals, and ordered Sarah to provide full financial documentation for a separate hearing about repayment of past support. Emily said it was a significant win, that judges rarely went this far in paternity fraud cases. But the fight wasn't over. Sarah could appeal, and the repayment case was going to be brutal. I asked what happened with Daniel. Emily said his DNA test had come back positive. He was Leo's biological father, and the state was now pursuing him for future child support while my case against Sarah for repayment moved forward separately. That's when Sarah made her biggest mistake. And I mean the kind of mistake that turns a legal case into a criminal investigation. About a month after the ruling, I got a notification from my bank about unusual activity on an old joint account. One I'd set up during our marriage for emergencies. It was supposed to have been closed during the divorce, but somehow, it had slipped through the cracks. Someone had charged $8,000 to it over 3 days. When I called the bank, they told me the charges were for cash advances and transfers. I immediately thought of Sarah. I pulled up the account history online and saw that she'd been using it sporadically for months, small charges here and there that I'd never noticed. But now, she'd gone big, probably panicking about losing child support and thinking she could grab whatever she could before everything crashed down. I reported it to the bank, filed a fraud claim, and called Emily. She told me this was potentially identity theft and that I should file a police report immediately. I went down to the station and gave them everything, the account statements, the timeline, proof that I'd never authorized the charges. The officer taking my report looked at me with this mix of pity and disbelief. Over the next month, the bank's fraud department confirmed that the signatures on the cash advance slips didn't match mine. The IP address for the online transfers traced back to Sarah's apartment. They were referring the case for prosecution. Emily called me and said Sarah had just made my repayment case 10 times easier. Because now it wasn't just about child support fraud. It was about financial fraud, forgery, and theft. The final hearing was scheduled for mid-December. By that point, Sarah's world was falling apart in real time. She'd lost her part-time job after the fraud investigation became public. Daniel's wife had filed for divorce after finding out about Leo. And the legal system was now pursuing Daniel for child support while simultaneously investigating Sarah for multiple counts of fraud. I showed up to court with Emily. Sarah showed up with a public defender because her original lawyer had dropped her. She looked completely different from the confident woman who had demanded more money just 7 months earlier. Judge Albright reviewed everything. The original paternity fraud. The account theft. The forged documents. The pattern of deception that had gone on for nearly a decade. When Sarah's public defender tried to argue that she'd been acting out of desperation as a single mother, Judge Albright cut him off. She said, "Desperation doesn't justify fraud." The ruling came down hard. Sarah was ordered to repay $60,000 in child support I'd paid over 9 years. She was placed on probation for the financial fraud. And she lost primary custody of Leo, pending a full evaluation. The judge said that Leo would be placed temporarily with Sarah's parents under court supervision while custody arrangements between Sarah and Daniel were being determined, and that I would have the option to pursue visitation if I wanted to maintain a relationship with the child I'd raised. I sat there, listening to all of this, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no victory. Just this overwhelming exhaustion that comes from watching something you built get demolished piece by piece. Sarah looked at me as they read the custody decision, her face blank, like she'd finally run out of performances. I wondered if she'd ever actually cared about Leo, or if he'd just been a paycheck to her all along. I walked out of that courthouse in mid-December with the winter air biting at my face. Emily told me the repayment would probably take years, that Sarah would likely declare bankruptcy, that I'd probably never see most of that money. But at least the truth was finally on record. I thanked her, paid her final invoice, and drove home to my one-bedroom apartment, where I'd been living like a broke college student for 9 years while funding someone else's lie. That night, I sat on my couch and thought about Leo. About whether I should pursue visitation. About whether it would hurt him more or help him to have me in his life after everything that had happened. And I realized I didn't have an answer. I didn't destroy my son's life. I stopped letting a lie fund itself. And if that makes me a monster in some people's eyes, I can live with that. Leo is in therapy now. Daniel is trying to figure out how to be a father to a 9-year-old he didn't know existed. And Sarah is living with her parents while she deals with probation and bankruptcy. I loved a child who wasn't mine by blood. I showed up for him when I thought he was mine. I did everything a father is supposed to do. What broke everything wasn't the DNA. It was the moment she demanded more money and thought the truth wouldn't matter. What do you think was the biggest mistake Sarah made in all of this?